When the locomotive let out its last hiss and the cars sighed to a stop, a plump young woman stepped down with her arms full of luggage, caught her skirt on a splintered plank, and scattered half her belongings across the platform. Jonah Reed, tall and raw-boned under the depot's tin eave, felt his notion of a willowy bride snap like over-dried twine. She looked up and saw him too, long as a fence post, hard-edged as weathered pine, and standing there with his hands to himself, then swallowed a small hurt that didn't make a sound. The platform at Red Willow baked under late summer heat. Smoke from the engine feathered into the high Wyoming sky, mixing with the smell of coal and hot iron. Jonah tugged his hat brim lower, took a single step like a man easing onto thin ice, and at last grabbed the flying handle of her trunk before it rolled under a baggage cart. "Let me," he said, rough-voiced from disuse. "Thank you," she answered, breathless, not daring to hold his eyes for more than a blink. They walked to the buckboard without speaking much. He stowed her trunk like it weighed near nothing, lashed it down neat as a spool in a drawer, then handed her up. The team rattled out of town along a ribbon of road that ran between cut banks of dust and sage. Wind burnished the grass to dull brass. A hawk hung and tilted. Jonah kept his eyes forward. His jaw made small movements as if he were chewing a thought he didn't like the taste of. The woman sat straight, both hands folded on a valise stitched with pansies that must have taken a winter of lamplight to make. "My name's Mabel Hart," she said when the depot was a far speck behind them. "Jonah Reed," he replied, though they both knew that already from ink and paper. The name sounded different out loud, heavier somehow, like iron brands heated to red and pressed to green hide. Permanent in a way sealed envelopes never were. They reached the homestead in the late blaze of afternoon. The house Jonah had built by hand squared its shoulders to the wind, boards planed so true that neither daylight nor dust found a way through. Beyond it, the big cow barn loomed, and a tight pen for calves, and a line of milk-white shirts on a rope that hung arrow-straight between two posts. A field edged the yard where oats would have bent pale heads if the summer hadn't scorched them to nothing. The well crank stood by a cedar box and a pile of cut kindling stacked just so. Everything wore the clean severity of a man who needed order like most men needed company. "This is home," Jonah said, like he was reciting a ledger. Kitchen on the right, bed on the left, loft for storage. We chocked the barn door at dusk. Wells covered after every pull. Stove takes cured wood. Cornmeal's in the red crock, flour in the blue. Don't swap 'em. He heard himself and winced inside, then added, gentler than the first try. "You'll be tired after the train. Rest some." "Of course," she said, carefully setting her embroidery valise on a chair. She reached to hang her cloak and clipped a small pair of shears with her sleeve. The shears toppled, clinked a bowl, and a neat mound of dry beans went skittering across the plank floor like hail. Mabel froze. Color rose in her cheeks. Jonah blew air through his nose and knelt. He gathered beans as if the salvation of a town depended on every last one. She sank beside him. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I'll be more careful." The first days found their pace by the tick-tock of small disasters. Mabel filled the kettle so full it drowned the stove's coals. She forgot the top latch on the south gate, and a calf wandered clear out to the arroyo. She sifted cornmeal into flour, and the breakfast loaves rose like proud men and collapsed like tired ones. She snapped a cloth so hard on the line that half the wooden pins leapt into the mud. Each time, Jonah stopped with his mouth half open, shoulders drawing tight as baling wire. He'd turn away, fix whatever needed fixing, and stuff whatever wanted saying down somewhere below his ribs. Not always successfully. One morning, with a cattle buyer due and the kitchen filled with the silver smell of milk, Mabel, in a hurry, flustered by the clatter, kicked the fresh-drawn pail. White ran into the seams of the floor like a summer snow. Jonah's voice came out too sharp. "Can't you look where you're going? Does everything you touch have to go sideways?" The sound bounced off the bare boards and back into his own ears, bigger and meaner than it felt when it left him. Mabel bit her lip until she made a bead of red. Her eyes turned glassy, but held their water. She wiped the mess without a word, moved around him as if she were smoke, and disappeared into the quiet of the kitchen corner. By evening, when he came in from checking fence, there lay a small book on the table, covered in blue calico with a loose thread at one corner. The front page said, in a careful, round hand, "Housebook, Mabel Hart." The pages that followed were ruled and labeled as if she'd measured them with a carpenter's square. Lighting the stove, only dry wood, paper nest, breathe gentle. Bread, blue crock for flour, red for cornmeal. Gates, top and bottom latches. Milking, set the pail against the wall. Each line held a stubborn grace. Jonah picked up the book the way a man picks up a live thing that trusts him, and something in his throat dried up that wasn't from dust. That night, he knocked at the kitchen doorframe. Mabel was straining what milk they'd saved, hair come loose and stuck to the back of her neck. "I was wrong to bark," Jonah said, the words like fence staples he had to hammer hard to drive. "I'll show you how to set the pail. It won't kick easy if it can't slip." She turned, surprise widening her dark eyes. "I'd like that," she said. "I'll write it down." Learning together made them both clumsy for a while, like two left-footed dancers. Jonah showed Mabel how to coax fire from damp breath and old match heads. Paper first, little kindling, bigger sticks crossed to leave a throat for the flames. He showed her how to twist the rope and flick it just so across a calf's front legs so the little bull would follow without a fight. He set her hands on the hoe so the pull sat in her shoulders, not the small of her back, and worked beside her until his own shirt lay dark with sweat. Mabel learned slow, then all at once. Once a thing clicked, she'd do it twice more to be sure it stuck. In turn, she did the arithmetic he hated. She sharpened a pencil to a hateful point and put the store's prices in neat columns, then ran a fingertip down their winter list. "If we let the 2 early calves go now," she said softly, "we'd have enough for wire to fence the east pasture. When snow comes and forage goes tight, we won't lose half the herd to wandering." Jonah stood like a man with his hat in his hands inside his own house. He didn't like selling early, didn't like giving up even a little, but he liked a winter with fewer strays and fewer miles on his bones. He nodded. The decision would save them later, though that truth stayed hidden like seed in hard ground. The wind turned thin and blade cold in September. Stories of dry lightning crawled up from the south, along with a price jump on hay. Sleep went shallow for Jonah. He woke easier, snapped sooner, and sometimes the old bark leapt back into his voice like a coyote at the chicken shed. Once he smacked a wooden spoon on the table and sent it skidding when Mabel set a pan down too near his elbow. She stood her ground. Her knuckles went white around the edge of her apron. "I am trying," Mabel said, quiet but not weak. "I know I'm clumsy. I am not lazy. I do not want you disappointed in me forever." Her words fell into him like slate plunging into a deep well. He wanted to tell her he was angrier at himself, at the sorry fact that he could fix a gear with a file and a nail but couldn't smooth his own tongue. The truth stuck in his throat, and he went outside to stare at a sky that looked cut and sanded by sun. Thunder walked over the grasslands 2 days later without a drop of rain in its pockets. Bolts jumped miles, white scars splitting the far rim. Jonah was at the barn when the wind went wrong, switched from a snake's whisper to a freight's laugh. He smelled smoke before he saw it. Thin at first, then ropey and black, rising from the north ridge. "Mabel!" he hollered, and she came to the porch with her sleeves rolled. "Fire on the hill." "What do we do?" Her voice trembled but didn't shake. "Cut a black ring, bare earth all around the house. Backfire it so the big blaze runs out of feed before it gets here." He grabbed the plow traces and ran, snapping them to the bay's hames. She bolted for the well, flung the lid open, and worked the crank so hard the chain rattled like iron bones. 3 buckets and 2 blankets later, she was on the roofline, belly down, hauling wet wool onto the tinder-dry thatch. The wind stiffened, smearing sparks across the sky like thrown sand. Jonah hauled the plow in a wide circle, carving a trench to dirt all around the house and barn, then struck a match and touched the edge. His small flame licked and crawled backward over the ground he'd opened, meeting no resistance in that narrow crown. The big fire rode down the ridge in a red wall, a beast that ate as it ran. The air got a taste, the way it does when every plant in the country is burning. "Take the colts out of the lean-to," Jonah yelled. Mabel dropped from the roof, hit the ground wrong, stumbled, pushed once, and got up again. The small barn door breathed smoke. She tied her kerchief across her mouth and went low. A colt skittered, whites of its eyes wide, a child huddled by the feed bin, Timmy Coyle, the neighbor's boy, lost where he had no business to be. "Timmy," she rasped, "hold my hand." He glommed on like a burr. She threw a wet blanket over his shoulders and hauled the colt by its halter, coughing now, blind water pouring from her eyes. She nearly went down on the threshold where the sill had charred to punk, but her shoulder hit wood, and her legs took over where thinking would have failed. A crack like the world changing came from the main barn. A hot beam, scorched to softness, sagged toward Jonah while he fought to free a cow whose horn had punched through a stall rail. He yanked the last strand when the beam gave. Splinters flew. One end pinned his shin to the dirt with the weight of the barn's whole history. He didn't cry out, exactly. The sound that tore from him was the kind men make when their held-back fear snaps. Mabel heard it and sprinted. She soaked a wool throw in the trough as she ran, slung it over her head and shoulders, and shouldered the smoke like a storm. The beam wouldn't budge by hand. She cast about, grabbed the hay hook, a length of iron with a cruel curve, and wedged it under the beam's end. "Push," she said to herself, to the iron, to the ground. She put her hips behind it, knees locked, face gone into a grimace that would have scared Sunday ladies. "Now, Jonah, pull." He heaved with both hands, twisting his trapped leg sideways until meat tore and hot flooded his boot. He came free into her arms. They staggered out together, him dragging one foot, her supporting most of his weight, and still he kept the cow's lead rope tight in his fist like a man keeps hold of his last sure thing. They collapsed in the black ring he'd burned. The big fire came, nipped greedy at the edge of the circle, found nothing to eat, and snarled smoke instead. It washed around them and went on. For a time the only sound was all 3 of them breathing, Mabel, Jonah, and the land. Timmy coughed and cried in small hiccup fits by the well, but was otherwise whole. Jonah stared at the woman beside him. Soot streaked her cheeks, ash made constellations across her brow, and her eyes, dark and wet, were a steady light. "Thank you," he said, plain and clean. For not leaving me in there. You'd have gone back for that cow if I had, she said, and then tried to laugh and coughed instead. Who else is going to teach me how to keep a pail from getting kicked? When the fire passed and the world stopped sounding like a kettle boiling over, the tally came due. One corner of the big barn sagged. Part of the fence on the west side looked like a row of eaten matches. Tools lay blistered, the iron fine but the handles done for. The house still stood. Most cattle had gathered behind the blackened ring as if they knew the trick of it. It was bruised work to set things right. Mabel washed Jonah's shin with the sting of carbolic and her own tears held back on purpose. She bound it with clean strips from a petticoat and changed the wrapping as if he were something precious. He taught her how to lever posts with a rock for a fulcrum and a pry stick so that she wasn't fighting the ground, and how to crimp barbed wire with pliers instead of hands so she didn't come away looking like she'd wrestled a cat. They spoke more. At first it was about feed and nails and chores, then it reached deeper places that didn't show like veins under skin. The first rain after the fire came like a benediction. It drummed the shingles and ran in silver threads off the eave. The kitchen found a low glow, and broth on the stove talked to itself. Jonah turned the spoon of his words over slowly. "I'm sorry about the depot," he said. "I saw you carrying all that, and I held back. I told myself you didn't want help. Truth is, I didn't know what to do with my hands. I ain't much for fine manners. Didn't want to insult you by making you a burden you ain't." She smiled without showing teeth. I could tell. Her fingers fussed with the hem of her apron. "And I'm not the photograph I sent. I hate sitting still for pictures. They shave you down in them, thin out the truth. I used to think if I got small enough, the whole world would go soft and quiet. But this is me, round as a summer moon. Clumsy sometimes. I can learn, though." "You have," Jonah said simply. "No one else hauled me out of a burning barn." They told each other the parts a letter can't hold. Jonah had buried both parents before he turned 19, then traded his last soft edges for the square lines of a house and a life he built plank by plank. He learned to cook because no one else would. He learned to mend because nothing lasted otherwise. Mabel came from a Missouri boarding house where soap lived under her fingernails and words lived in ledgers. Men had come by to look her over before. One said she had a good temper, which was like admiring a horse's feed bin, and then picked a girl easy to tuck under an arm like a parcel. Jonah took her hand across the table. It was warm from the stove and strong from work. "Your hands aren't small," he said, "but they're the right kind. I need what they can do." They plowed a new strip where the fire had scorched the ground bare. "Ash makes good seed bed," Jonah told her, and Mabel believed him because sprouts are stubborn in their faith. She spread oat seed slow and steady, like someone blessing what she loved but didn't know how to pray over properly. In her house book she wrote, "Today, start again." Then, under that, smaller. "Don't be afraid of breaking things." Jonah leaned on the table and grinned in a lopsided way that left dimples he hardly ever showed. "Add," he said. When she glanced up, he took the pencil and wrote, "Don't be afraid of saying things either." Neighbors came nosing around after news of the blaze lit up the town faster than any lantern. Widow Wilson brought a basket of biscuits and said, with a voice sharp enough to cut apple peel, but a look that would have tucked a blanket around you, "She's got sand. This one." She aimed her chin at Jonah. "And you learn to soften your holler." He colored at the tips of his ears. The saloon keeper dropped off a bundle of good handles. The freight man sold a roll of wire for $1 less than he ought to have. A few tongues clicked. the way folks do when they're bothered that someone else's fire didn't take the whole place down. Mabel only washed and mended and carried on. One afternoon she was hauling water to the yard when she caught Jonah watching her too long. Not in pity, not with the put-upon tolerance of a man who'd made a bargain he couldn't stand, but with the open plain of a man who'd found shade and didn't trust it yet. "Mabel," he said, and his voice had sawdust and honey both in it. She faced him, drying her hands on her skirt. "Yes? I speak crooked as a dog's leg sometimes, but I aim to try straighter." He took a step nearer, close enough that she could see the little pale scar in his left eyebrow where a colt had caught him years back. "I care for you, not as someone who makes bread or ticks boxes in a book. As you." She blinked, steady as a mule. "I care for you too," she said. "Not because you're tall, or because you can fix fence quicker than weather can break it, though both are true. Because you work kind once you know where to put it. And because you let me learn." They didn't rush it. Western hearts, like Western weather, could swing wild. It felt better to build something that wouldn't blow down. Still, the house turned warmer by degrees. Jonah's temper, once quick as a match, started needing a strike and a second thought to catch. He warned her before a gate sprang. He asked instead of ordered. He said please and meant it. Mabel's hands learned where everything lived, and when they fumbled, she laughed first and then fixed the fumble, and nobody bled over it. Timmy Coyle's ma came by with a pie that tasted like lard and relief and cried into Mabel's shoulder at the well. "He wandered off," she said. "Chasing grasshoppers. I'd have buried my boy if not for you." Mabel told her it was the blankets and the water and the circle Jonah burned. Truth is, it was the two of them together. That became the shape of most things after. Two people where one had been. A cold snap came early that year. The first skim of ice on the water trough made a rifle crack when you knocked it. They spent evenings by the stove, the housebook open with flour dust caught in the spine. New entries turned up. Winter stores, render lard before freeze, count jars, rotate by date. Fence, walk east line after any blow. Words, too, that didn't belong to a tool list slipped in, tucked among the instructions like pressed flowers. Remember to rest. Remember to listen. Remember we're on the same side. On Sundays, when the wind chose not to knife and the team needed a stretch, they'd go down to Red Willow together. Folks stared the way folks do, curious, calculating, kind, all at once. They ate stew at the cafe, and Jonah, who had never noticed such things in his life, wiped the table's sticky ring from a previous cup because he knew Mabel's sleeve would find it otherwise. She bought needles and a small square of bright cloth to make a curtain for the tiny window by the bed. He bought her a new kettle after the handle on the old one loosened and scalded her thumb, drove back to town the same afternoon, in fact, because he couldn't abide the sight of a blister under her ring finger. Snow came for real, and the world went muffled. Coyotes made exclamation points in the night. The cattle breathed steam and stood hip-shot, patient as monks. On a dawn when the air was so clear that sound seemed to carry farther than distance itself, Jonah woke to the small, ordinary music of Mabel moving around the kitchen, cup, spoon, skillet, lid, and realized that the noise, which would have grated on him once, sounded like a song he would not know how to live without. He lay there a minute, grateful and a little afraid of how big gratitude can feel. The spring that followed threw up green like a promise kept. The black ring around the house, where fire had had its way, turned the brightest first. Oats shouldered up in tidy ranks. Mabel went barefoot in the soft days and rinsed her feet at the pump before she came inside because she'd written down a note that said, "Dirt outside, clean inside, and habits stuck once they made ink under her hand." Jonah mended the last singed corner of the barn and left the burn scar on the beam where his leg had been pinned, not as a thing to brood on, but as a mark that said, "Here the story turned." They stood one evening at the ridge where lightning had started all that mess. The grass there was new and soft. The wind hauled the smell of sage clean through them. "I thought you'd send me back," Mabel said suddenly, quiet as a rabbit. "Those first days, when I broke every other thing I touched." Jonah shook his head. "I never wrote the letter. Thought about it in ways I ain't proud. But then you set that book on the table, and I reckon I understood more about you in 3 lines than I did in a dozen pages before. You didn't ask to be smaller. You asked to be taught. That's a kind of courage a man ought to meet halfway." She leaned into him, warm and heavy through both their coats. "I asked because I wanted to be here," she said. "Not just anywhere. Here." A meadowlark cut loose on a fence post with a string of notes that sounded like water and laughter braided together. Jonah put his arm around her. He had to reach farther than he used to make room for another heart next to his, and he was glad to. When summer came again, their house was different without looking different. The order inside had loosened enough to let comfort in. A chipped cup found a home because Mabel liked the lip. Jonah's shirt still hung in a row, but one had new blue stitching at the cuff because she'd thought it would please him, and it did. The house book fattened with pages. Early in the back she'd left 2 blank sheets on purpose. On one, under the date, she wrote in her careful hand, "Today we planted the last of the oats." On the line below, Jonah took the pencil and, with his slower block letters, added, "Today I didn't raise my voice." Little victories, signed and witnessed. There were setbacks. There always are. A late hail beat shattered a week's worth of work in 10 minutes. A heifer came down with something mean and died before morning. A letter from back east brought Mabel a grief she hadn't expected, and she wept with her face in Jonah's shirt while he rubbed circles on her back and said nothing, because sometimes nothing is the best word. But nothing knocked them apart the way the first wind might have. They had a ring burned around them now, of shared work and hard talk and foolish laughter. Fire could race in all it wanted. It would run out of feed at the edge. On a clear evening not long after the second haying, Jonah took the long way back from the north line and found himself walking slower as the house came into view. The window by the kitchen threw a soft square of yellow on the yard. Somebody had tied a length of calico above the bed to make a curtained nook, and somebody else had moved the table just a little so that morning light would land where hands did dough and sums. His leg ached where the scar went deep. He didn't mind it. He opened the door, and the smell of fresh bread and sun-dried cloth came at him like a welcome. Mabel turned from the stove with flour on her cheek and that look she wore now and then, the one that said she was glad he had walked through that particular door. He touched his hat brim, though there was no need for hats between them. "Mrs. Reed," he said. They had married proper in spring, with the preacher from town and a cake Widow Wilson swore had no lard, though everyone knew better. "Mr. Reed," she answered. "Your supper's ready." Jonah took his chair, and before they ate, he reached a hand across the short stretch of table. Mabel put hers in it. He said grace brief, as he always had, but the line he added was new, and he added it every night after. "Thank you for the work that made this and the person who did it with me." Later, they sat on the stoop with mugs in their hands, watching the light fade out of the basin. Crickets started up when the sun touched down. Mabel leaned her head on Jonah's shoulder. "Do you think we'll ever stop tripping over things?" she asked, amusement tucked into the last word. "Likely not," he said, grinning into the dark. "But we ain't alone to fall anymore." She smiled, and the shape of it found its place against his arm as if it had been made to fit there. The wind ran a cool finger through the grass and hummed under the eaves. Somewhere down in the draw, a coyote gave its high, foolish laugh, answered by another. Jonah squeezed her hand. The world would burn again, and rain, and freeze, and bloom. It always did. But tonight, the circle held, and inside it, two people had learned the stubborn art of staying.